Hi guys, this is Shubham and this is the second video in the series Project Pandas. And in this video, we will learn how to load data sets into a Panda data frame. And so let's get started. First thing we would do is import Pandas as PD. And the reason for importing it as PD is because we won't have to write Pandas everywhere. We could just write PD, and it's the standard convention to import it as PD. You could import it as anything you like, but it's the standard convention. Next, we would define a variable that would contain our data frame, and then PD dot read CSV, and the first parameter that you will pass is the path of your data set. So here it's a CSV. CSV basically stands for comma separated values. If you were to look it in a look it in a I mean in a notepad kind of thing, you would see it's just data separated by comma. So if you have to understand it, imagine it like Excel. Each row is represented by each line and each column is separated by a comma. So if you were directly loaded in a Excel, you would see it's really straightforward. It's a very simple kind of data set. So here, let's do this, and boom, our data set is loaded. So it was a really simple data set following all the standard conventions. So it was really easy to load it. But if you were to see here, you will find that there are a lot of parameters that you can pass in the read CSV function. So let's take a look at some of the most important parameters, and these parameters you would generally be using in loading different kind of data sets. So first of all, I would like to explain the delimiter part. So what is a delimiter? Delimiter is basically the separator that you see here. And in this case, you can clearly see it is separated by a comma. So if you were to pass the comma, and comma is also the default value here. So if you don't write comma, it by default takes the delimiter as comma. And let's do this again, the same thing, because the delimiter is the comma. Next important parameter is headers. So if you see here, the first row, the first row was set as headers by the pandas by default. So I mean, in this case, it's true. The first row is headers, actually the headers, but in some cases you might find that the first row represents the data, not the headers. So in that case, what you could do is you can pass none here. So what it will do is it won't take the first row as the header. So let's check it out what it does. So here you see earlier this was taken as headers, but now it's the part of our data, not the headers. So that's that. So actually we don't need it, but for the sake of understanding, I'm doing this. Next thing I would like to show you is by default what Pandas does it generates its own index, and it's a ranged index from 0 to 891. Basically, the number of rows you have, it sets an index. But if you see here, the index has already been predefined in the data, and for some reason you want to use this column as your index, not the range index that Pandas created. What you can do is index column is equal to, the column name is right now 0, so I would pass 0 here, and boom, here you can see that the index has now been the passenger ID rather than the ranged index that Pandas created. And let's say like here you want to set your own headers. So here you see that headers that the first row was taken as data. Now you want to set your own headers instead of a ranged header here. So what you can do is you can pass a parameter by names. Names is equal to, in this you have to pass a list, and the number of elements in the list should be equal to the number of rows you have. In this case we have 10 rows, so the numbers should be like, so it should be something like this. Now you see that the headers is now been shifted to the list that we passed, and in the same order that it was present in the list. So now you have that as headers here. So basically that's all about loading this particular data set, and we don't need these. I just, for the sake of explanation, I passed in these parameters, but default values work here really fine. So let's just put that and see the data frame is perfectly loaded. So let's now move into the second data set, which I actually wanted to show you. What anomaly here you would find it, although it's a CSV file and CSV stands for comma separated values, here the values are not separated by a comma, but by the number of white spaces, or aka spaces. So in this, if you were to load this, it would load something really weird. Let me show you. So let's name it dfh is equal to pd dot read csv, and then pass in the path. So now if I were to load it by default values, you will see something like this. Everything it has been loaded into the same column because the delimiter by default is comma, and we do not see a comma here, so pandas interpreted everything to be in a single column. So but that's not the case here. So what we would have to do is we would have to explain to it, rather than using comma as a delimiter, you would have to use any number of white spaces. And the reason for saying any number of white spaces is, if you look closely here, there are two spaces in between two values, but in the next row there are three spaces. So you would have to explain it to pandas that you should take any number of white spaces as your delimiter rather than the commas. So for what can be done for that? So first option is using a regular expression. If you don't know much about regular expression, don't worry. I mean, it's a simple thing of defining pattern in strings. You can check out Google for that. It's not that much of a deal. So let's check it out. What will happen now? We have set the delimiter as any number of white spaces with the help of a regular expression. Now, if you see the data frame is actually, I mean, almost loaded correctly. It now gets what the delimiter should be, but the problem lies that it has again taken the first row as header. We do not want that. We need that as part of our data. So we would have to again define it, tell it no. So take header as none. Now if you were to see it's loaded correctly. It has not taken the first row as the header, and it looks fine, but still the name of the columns is missing. It has generated a default range index for the columns, but we do not want that. So we want it to be, we want it to represent, we want the something specific to represent the each column. And I have gotten the names of the column from the description from Kaggle here. You can check it out. The links to the each of the data set would be in the description. So feel free to check it out. So here I have already extracted the names. So let me also pass that parameter name. We would have to pass names as this list. So this represent the what the actual header should be. Now if we load again, now the data is finally loaded perfectly. So there are a lot of parameters. Feel free to explore. There are these many parameters, but mostly you won't be using those. You will be using the ones that I have described. And one more thing I would like to explain is, if you are not very comfortable with regular expressions, Pandas also has a delimiter white space, which tells it to use any number of white spaces as a delimiter. So instead of passing regular expression, if you pass the parameter delim underscore white spaces as true, it will infer that here the delimiter should be any number of white spaces. And if you load that again, the same thing. So it's loaded perfectly. So that's all for loading data frames. In the next video, we will further discuss about the kind of data structures that you can have in pandas and how to work on manipulation and inference part. So stay tuned.